and welcome to this next segment on notebookSnap. If you have not installed notebookSnap, you'll want to watch our earlier video. You'll be directed to this particular GitHub site. And as part of the installation, you'll have two more notebooks installed, our runtime, and then notebookSnap Basics. And notebookSnap Basics is what I'll be covering in this video. All right, so conceptually, this is how it works. You're obviously working in Azure Data Studio or your favorite SQL editor, and you're creating SQL queries, that is content, to populate your ETL or ELT projects. And ELT and ETL obviously stands for the first extract, load, then transform, or the data movement. And then the transformation, ETL, we do support it, but I think you'll find it's much more powerful, much more flexible, especially in the cloud world, to use ELT. In populating your notebooks, and we have lots of videos on notebooks. If you have not gone down that road, I recommend you learn the basics of how to use notebooks. Essentially, a notebook gives you three components: text, code, and results. The text is markdown. It's a high quality, rich text with links and images, etc. The code, of course, which is what will run, because notebooks are all about running code. And notebooks also give you the results of the query that you ran. And the kernel could be SQL, could be PowerShell. What notebookSnap allows you to do is take those cells within your notebooks. And so just a quick visual of what that looks like. Here's a notebook cell. This is code that you would execute. This is the result. And this is the text. And we'll revisit this in just a minute. When you create this content, we have a way to take your files, because these are all simply within your file system. I go back to Azure Data Studio and I click on the Explorer. You can see all of these files. These are .sql files. These are notebooks, .ipynb. There's images in here. There's some YAML, which gives you your table of content, etc. But essentially, you're working simply within a file system. Because of that, you can use Git and even GitHub if you want to push this stuff to the cloud to have a very powerful and free source control for your SQL files in your notebooks. Once you've created that content or that logic within notebooks, you can automatically move those over into eltSnap, which is a way to orchestrate all of these code cells that you put together. And that could be SQL, it could be PowerShell. This example will simply use SQL code cells, and then we'll have a subsequent one where we'll show you how to mix kernels. But what we're doing here with notebookSnap is taking these assets, these code assets that are in .sql files and notebooks, and we're putting that into an equivalent code cell, but it's actually called a package, technically within eltSnap. Once we move that over into the package, then we can invoke a runtime. And the runtime adds a great deal of value to these assets. It allows you to schedule it and run, which is nothing more than putting it into the command line. And then any scheduling program where you can invoke a command line can run your projects. You also can then parameterize it, because often you would build something for a dev environment, but then want to change the environment and or parameter values. And actually, environments are driven by parameters for your server names, your database names, etc. Now you can still run it with parameters within Azure Data Studio as a notebook, even as .sql, and we'll show you how we do that. But then when you put it through the runtime, it takes on a life of its own. And it says, oh, okay, I'm running in test, and I know all the server names and database names and parameters to use within the test environment or prod, etc. Lots of scheduling options. You can use SQL Agent, you can use Windows Scheduler, but any scheduler that'll run a command line. You get multi-kernel support, which is something you don't get standard, or currently you don't get within Azure Data Studio notebooks. We may have that in the future, it's just not there yet. You get parallel processing. Again, you can't do that with a .sql file. You can't do that in a single notebook. You can achieve the parallel processing as a eltSnap project. You get email notifications, so alerts, or there's other options for just informational emails. You get that as well. And then it ties to dashboard metrics for your runtime. So at runtime, it'll actually record row counts and start end times. And so it adds a whole lot of value and really capabilities just by pushing your SQL files and your notebook files into eltSnap. So let's see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and open up the same project. I'm going to use this navigation. It's a little bit cleaner. The database log cleanup is going to show us the actual code cells, and the code cell actually shows us two, and we have in two databases where we have logs, and this will simply clean up old log files. It's a very simple two-step project. What's interesting, however, is that there are two different connections. Now, you're probably aware in Azure Data Studio, when you go to run a code cell, you have to have a connection. If you click on, you select a connection, this will be eltSnap, it will run this first one, and you can notice I put a comment that this should run in eltSnap v2, but down here, this actually runs on a separate connection. So now we have a little bit of a quandary. It's not a problem if I run these individually, putting it in the right context, but I can't use the run all because it will run it on a single connection, but I need two different connections. So the first thing we have to do is add a little bit of metadata, which is pretty much what we're seeing here in this comment, so that we know when we import it into eltSnap, we have the right context. So what you notice here is we take notebooks and SQL file and we add this metadata. It's just enough metadata. It is actually in the notebook, or it would be in a comment in a SQL file. And it's a JSON metadata instructions on when you move it into eltSnap, how to put into effect the custom or the runtime values that you'll want that go beyond what you can do within a notebook. It would just be like a SQL script. Well, if you're going to run that SQL script and you have a couple of commands, a couple of SQL statements, they can't run off of two different connections. So it's really the same puzzle. The way that we achieve this is we add metadata. You can view the metadata using our extension. The extension, which is part of the install, is put into effect via the command palette. I'm going to hit F1. That'll take me to the command palette, and you can see this option here, edit notebook cell metadata. So now you can see we have a total of 3 patterns, and that's really all you need. The data flow is your extract and load, and the execute SQL is your transform. So you have EL and T. Now you can, obviously you do EL, do a transformation, do another extract and load, and get an ETL style. And there's hundreds of variations on that theme, but it simply is rearranging your transformations and your data flows. And finally, we do have an execute process, and this is for everything else, everything that's not SQL core language related, like you want to do an FTP from a site. Well, you would invoke a command line interface to your favorite FTP utility, or you want to copy files. Well, that would be probably a PowerShell. And PowerShell is an execute process where you would invoke PowerShell and give it a commandlet. And we'll show you an example of this in our next video. We provide the name of the cell. So we're actually formally naming this particular code cell. Call it eltSnap log delete, running on this connection, eltSnap v2. If we look at the second one, it's almost identical. It's an execute SQL. It has a different name, and then it has a different source connection. So that's all the configuration that you would need to do And then when you ingest it, we have a notebook to do the ingestion as well. It just moves it from your file system into the database. And then once you do that, you can actually execute this. So we have another command palette option, which is the open up the forms for eltSnap. So let me go ahead and click on that, and you can see the project. There's just two steps to it, or two packages. So the cells transform into packages. And now I can click on this Run button. By clicking on the Run button, I can choose a different environment. I can choose different templates depending on whether you want email alerts, whether you want informational messages via email, or just simple framework logging. When I click on Run, it will go ahead and it will put the command line into Azure Data Studio within the terminal window. So you can see it's going to invoke our runtime. This is our Python runtime. It's going to go to this server and this database to get the definition of the project, which you just saw, database log cleanup, and it's going to put it on this template. Now, if you want a richer template, you just give it the name, for example, email alerts. You'll still get the framework logging, but then if an error occurs, you'll get an email alert. You don't have to change the project, you just change the template. So all you have to do now is hit enter, and it will invoke the runtime. It'll show you what your two connections are. So we had the ELT framework and eltSnap. It runs the first one, and these could run in parallel. And we'll show you how to do that in our next video as well. So it ran the two, it did the log deletes. I just ran this, so there's something to delete. Everything is within 2 weeks. And you can set that threshold as well within the parameters. Now I can take any project, any scheduling program, put this command line in, and any of the parameters that you want to run in like a different environment. So I can have an environment variable and then set that to dev, test, prod. That's the only change you need in order to run this project in other environments. I hope that was helpful. Again, we'll have another follow-up video on mixing kernels, some PowerShell, some SQL running in parallel, and having a little bit more complex projects.